Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. If there was ever a time in recent memory that feels like a darkest valley, this is it. All around us, people are scared and lonely and confused. We all feel vulnerable and unsure of our next steps, doing the very best we can with all of that information that we're given. So here we are today, worshiping online instead of together in our 2 worship centers, watching a screen or listening on a phone, instead of hugging one another, singing together, eating together, sharing life together, just by being present to one another. Instead of meeting together, studying together, dreaming together, growing together, we are sort of in the middle of a gigantic pause. And in that pause, we see the way that society is reacting. Panicking, hoarding, pontificating, politicizing, rioting on one hand, hunkering down and isolating and succumbing to fear on the other. But there are many, many, many stories emerging of generosity and compassion as people reach out to the most vulnerable among us. For instance, the medium rare steakhouse in Washington, D.C., faced with closure like all of our restaurants here in Tucson, put out a call Tuesday night that anyone who wanted a steak dinner could just call and it would be delivered. And not only did they get calls for the meals, they got calls from people volunteering to be drivers for the delivery. So hundreds of meals were delivered Tuesday night. What a gift. And Desert Skies folks are no different. While the impact on our own community has been huge, schools have been shut down, so parents are scrambling for things to do with their kids. Our tutoring program has been suspended, and so kids who have been struggling with school are now going to get maybe further behind. People have lost their part-time and full-time jobs that have been making ends meet for their families. The closure of businesses means uncertainty economically for so many. And I have received calls from you, from many of you, asking, how can I help? So if any of you need help buying groceries, maybe you've been laid off your jobs and need a grocery gift card, need someone to check up on you, please let us know. Because people have been volunteering their time and their resources to make sure that our Desert Skies family and our surrounding community is cared for. And our nation, our state, our country, all are working hard to address the concerns of these times. Right now, I think the jury is still out on how well everything's working, but we are working together. I mean, even Democrats and Republicans in Congress are actually talking and negotiating with each other for the first time in a very long time. Hospital ships are being dispatched to areas with hospital bed shortages. We see hopeful memes on social media. We get some positive reports. I just heard today that grocery stores will be restocked and food will be available. Social distancing does seem to be slowing down the spread of the coronavirus, and children and their families are surviving the closing of schools, mostly. But isn't it interesting that this solution, in the words of the 23rd Psalm, that the solution to some of this is reflected in that very psalm today? I think that the 23rd Psalm is one of those cannot miss texts for living the Christian life every single day of the week. A couple of years ago, there was a survey done at Luther Seminary, and one question the survey posed was, is there a text that is important for you in difficult times? Now, not all people answered that question, but of those who did, 15% of the respondents said Psalm 23, and another 10% named the Psalms in general. So the Psalms, and especially this 23rd Psalm, speak powerfully to and for God's people in times such as these. You might say that Psalm 23 is an essential part of our spiritual journey, like the putter is an essential club for the golfer, or the chef's knife is an essential tech tool for a cook. And Psalm 23 is the essential text for the daily life of faith. And yes, you can golf without a putter, you can cook without a chef's knife, and you can live the Christian life without Psalm 23, but who would want to? Because this psalm reminds readers about the beauties of living life in the here and now, even amid the usual darkness that accompanies day-to-day life. So this psalm begins with a faithful and hopeful claim. The Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. You see, God took care of the Israelites as they wandered through the desert. To be sure, life wasn't always easy, but that's life. And those 40 years that Israel wandered might have seen a lot of grumbling and complaining, but they also saw manna fall free from heaven, the birth of a new generation, and eventual progress to the promised land. God cared for the wandering people, and they lacked nothing. And the benefits of that relationship are clear. You have faith in the God who shepherds you through the wilderness, for history tells you that this God will not let you lack what you need. This God will lead you to the promised land, provide you green pastures in the form of food, still waters in the form of drink, and a straight path, which is protection. And then that shepherd metaphor continues. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they protect me or comfort me. Now, the King James translation, walk through the valley of the shadow of death, is probably most famous. But the more appropriate translation from the original Hebrew truly is likely something more akin to the darkest valley, as we read in our scripture text from the Common English Bible, and it's there in the NRSV as well. So despite how perplexing it might be while we stumble our way through the darkness, hope and trust are appropriate responses. They keep us moving toward life. And then the wonderful final two verses of the psalm that move to this wonderful image of God as a gracious host who prepares this banquet table. And the table is spread in the presence of my enemies who seem to watch from the sidelines as God anoints the head of the psalmist and fills the psalmist's cup to overflowing. And then, somewhat playfully, the psalmist turns this image of an enemy who pursues, which can be a frightening image for sure, into something wonderful and good and life-affirming, because the psalm ends with yet another nod toward life and living. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. So life in the here and the now can be joyous and banquet-filled, especially if one trusts in the guidance and protection of the shepherd and the benevolent provider of the banquet. Now, assurance, knowing about God's presence and care, does not erase the darkest valleys of evil and suffering. Nowhere in the Psalms do we find sort of a naive trust, but always one that is fully aware of what's going on in the world out there and what has been lost. So divine deliverance does not mean that evil is eradicated. Nope, it's still in the presence of enemies that the psalmist sits down at God's table. And there is no indicator that the psalmist and his enemies ever became friends. But Psalm 23 insists that we can trust in deliverance in the midst of evil, that deliverance is true and it's real. And whatever preys upon us individually and as communities, we are not defeated because God is with us. And imagine if we really lived as if we really knew this was true, as if we really feared no evil because our trust is in God. I mean, imagine where we no longer are being driven by where our fear might take us. Imagine if we, the vulnerable flock of the divine, knew ourselves forever to be pursued by the goodness and mercy of God in the midst of all of our shadows and doubts and uncertainties, not just when we're in the throes of a community crisis, but in our personal lives as well. Because those darkest valleys, those shadowlands, appear without warning. And our spiritual journey is all about preparing for them so that we can know the trust and the hope of the psalmist. And what we mean by shadowlands are those darker places in our own humanity, in our heart and soul, those places that haunt our existence and too often determine our behavior. And the shadow includes all that we hate about ourselves, as well as all of that wonderful potential that we doubt or deny that we have. So we call those darker aspects of ourselves shadowlands because we would rather they remained in the shadows where neither we nor others could see them very well. In fact, what we'd really prefer is that they just go away. But unfortunately, since every human being is an odd mixture of darkness and light, often the best that we can do is shine a little light on our darkness just to see what's really there. And for us here at Desert Skies, it is the light of God's love as well as the shared embrace of this faith community that makes us bold enough to intentionally enter those dark places, those shadowlands in our lives, to learn what they might teach us. And that pause in our normal routine, this can be a time of reflection and opening of ourselves to new ways of seeing God at work in the world. And if we cannot make our shadows go away, at least we can acknowledge, observe, examine them a little more clearly, and perhaps more kindly in the light of God's love. And so because we here at Desert Skies have each other, and we know that God has us, let us dare this Lenten season when we are confined to this extended pause in our normal routine. Let that time be a time where we can shine some light on our shadow, to air out maybe some of those things that we've tried to hide from others, let alone ourselves, maybe even snuggle up to our own madness long enough to hear just what it has to say. For the same passion that leads us away from God can also lead us back to God and to our true selves, despite any time we might spend in the shadows. Helen Keller once said, "Defeat is simply a signal to press onward." And John Maxwell proposed that a difficult time can be more readily endured if we retain the conviction that our existence holds a purpose, a cause to pursue, a person to love, a goal to achieve. Or, as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, the line between failure and success is so fine that we scarcely know when we pass it, so fine that we are often on the line and we do not know it. There was once a Sunday school teacher who gave his class an assignment to learn the whole 23rd Psalm by the next Sunday, because each of them was going to recite it to the whole church. And so a little boy named Bobby, he just couldn't get it all in his head, and he struggled all week long. And finally, Sunday came, and the church was packed out, standing room only, and suddenly it was Bobby's turn to say the psalm. And his teacher whispered, "Okay, Bobby, it's your turn." Bobby was shaking like a leaf and sweating bullets, and then suddenly, without warning, he shouted out, "The Lord is my shepherd, and that's all I need to know." What is it that you need to know today to move to a place of trust that God will see you through the darkest valleys, through those shadowlands? What inner work might you need to do to quit pretending to be something or someone that you are not, in order that you can be what God intended you to be all along? Madeleine L'Engle wrote in her book, Glimpses of Grace, "There's a true story I love about a house party in one of the big English country houses. Often after dinner at those parties, people gave recitations, they would sing, and use whatever talent they have to entertain the company. And one year, a famous actor was among the guests, and when it came his turn to perform, he recited the 23rd Psalm, perhaps the most beloved psalm in the Psalter. His rendition was magnificent, and there was much applause. At the end of the evening, someone noticed a little old great aunt dozing in the corner. She was deaf as a post and had missed most of what was going on, but she was urged to get up and recite something. I guess in those days, people used to memorize a lot of poetry. So she stood up, and in her quavery old voice, she started, "The Lord is my shepherd," and went on to the end of the psalm. And when she had finished, there were tears in many eyes. Later, one of the guests approached the famous actor. "You recited that psalm absolutely superbly. It was incomparable. So why were we moved to tears by that funny little old lady?" And he replied, "I know the psalm. She knows the shepherd." We all know the psalm. In this time of turmoil, social distancing, isolation, and uncertainty, may we spend some time getting to know the shepherd, and then we'll make it through these darkest valleys together.